Welcome back to my second talk on cultural theory of international relations. For those of you who read it, I apologize for its heft and length. Much of it is an attempt to show in historical cases the value of my theory from ancient to modern times. That's important for several reasons. Ancient times, particularly Greek, Hellenist, and the Roman era, allows me to show the power of thumos as a motive in politics, because it was the dominant motive in this era for the polities I analyze. This doesn't mean that concern for security, which gives rise to fear, or appetite, which most often finds expression in the quest for material well-being and affluence, that they weren't also motives. They were motives that were theorized as secondary by Greeks, Hellenes, and Romans. So they had the need to explain away what they were doing, or somehow to defend it in the name of honor. But I could also show cases documented very nicely in one instance through Julius Caesar's memoirs, of where the quest of his young warriors for honor stands in the way of victory and poses a security threat to the army, forcing him to make difficult choices, and choices that were not so popular. This is also true in the Middle Ages, where I have 2 chapters. But when we come to the modern world, we find a different set of problems. Now, the modern world is challenging to me in a different kind of way. In the first place, it is a hard case, by the conventional wisdom, for me to establish the power of thumos and the quest for honor and standing as a dominant motive. By the 20th century, in the literature and in the political discourse, security had very much emerged as the dominant concern, and a legitimate dominant concern in the eyes of those who wrote about it. The quest for standing and honor was seen as unacceptable in the pursuit of foreign policy, especially if it involved large sums of money and the possible deaths of many people. Liberals, more broadly the bourgeoisie in their rise to power, had to delegitimize the aristocracy. The aristocracy had rested its power and privileges on both allegedly what it provided for society, but also in its pursuit of honor. In modern novels and modern philosophy, going back as far as Cervantes, honor is attacked as a motive. It's seen as indulgent, costly to ordinary people, a principal cause of war, and something to be eliminated in foreign affairs. This is a point made most dramatically by British radicals in the 19th century, like John Bright and Richard Cobden, and of course is reflected in the liberal view today with the Democratic Peace program, holding that in democratic countries, states would not go to war against other democratic countries, and there would be no war if the world was democratic, in part because these states would be responsive to the needs of their citizens, and those needs would primarily consist of security and well-being, both of which require collaborative relations with neighbors. So thumos was expunged from the philosophical and political lexicon. And realism in the post-war period became the dominant IR paradigm as we know. It focuses on security, so liberals on material well-being, realists on security. Nobody addresses thumos and its drive for standing and honor. It's entirely ignored. So I'm like a salmon swimming upstream. Indeed, one of the reviewers described me that way, in my attempt to show that this motive is not only important, but in many respects dominant. So I make the case that in World War I, if we look at the behavior, especially of the initiators of Germany and Austria, that it was primarily about honor. Although framed somewhat differently in Germany so that the war could be sold to the Social Democrats as one of security and holding the line in the West against the barbaric Russian autocracy. I argue in my last case, the Anglo-American intervention in Iraq, that we have an even stronger case for the role of thumos. That George Bush Sr. sent his former advisors, people like Scowcroft and Kissinger and others, to dissuade his son from going to war on the grounds that there was no security or economic interest at stake. The notion that the U.S. was doing this for oil, propagated by the likes of Noam Chomsky, makes no sense whatsoever. The oil companies didn't want war. They were afraid it would disrupt or even destroy oil supplies. For the most part, they wanted an end to sanctions so they could buy and distribute the oil and make money as they had in the past. The U.S., I argue, went to war because those in the Bush administration, notably people like Cheney and Rumsfeld and Condi Rice, were concerned with maintaining American hegemony. They thought that by waging a campaign of shock and awe, that they could intimidate friend and foe alike, prevent North Korea and Iran from proliferating, and in fact going to war did the very reverse, and also lock in American hegemony in the face of a rising China. There's no doubt, in my view, that the motive of status is alive and well in international relations, a fundamental cause of conflict, and a cause of conflict that's less amenable to diplomatic resolution than material or strategic interests, because once emotions become involved, there's much less room for compromise. So the purpose of this book, when I go from the theoretical perspective on it to the practical one, is to make people aware of the power of the drive for self-esteem in human beings, which is projected onto sports teams, but above all to states, People feel good when their teams or countries win, so to speak, and miserable when they lose. Political leaders respond to these needs, and political leaders have these needs themselves. So for all of these reasons, international relations theory shows a significant disconnect with the practice of international relations and the fundamental causes of conflict. I think I make my case, and do so, as I noted earlier, by picking hard cases. Theories are most convincing when they pick cases where it doesn't look like at the outset they have much to say. Now, the second reason, and I noted that there were multiple differences between the ancient and the modern world that creates a problem for me, is a change in discourse. Let me go back a step here and tell you how I handled my case studies. I'm very keen to avoid tautology, to interpret cases in terms of my framework, and then use that interpretation as proof that I was right. What I wanted to do was to get some sense of the importance of thumos in the society at large and as a foreign policy motive. To do that, I did not look at foreign policy. Rather, I looked at domestic policy and various other writings, even about interpersonal relations, to be able to make a judgment about the relative importance of these motives. That would then allow me to predict the balance that you would see in foreign policy. Only then did I approach foreign policy to see if the behavior that I studied matched with the predictions that derive from my examination of domestic sources. This worked all the way up until the modern period. What happened in the modern era is increasingly appetite and thumos were not treated in the literature as separate motives. Rather, they merged. So if we read Rousseau or David Hume, both of them talk about how increasingly people want material goods, not for whatever benefits they confer in and of themselves, but rather to make claims of status. We see this very much today. Thorstein Veblen, at the beginning of the 20th century, invented the term conspicuous consumption, arguing that in appetite-based worlds, status is a function of wealth, but really of the display of wealth. That's why we have mega mansions. It is why people drive fancy cars and pay a lot for often useless bells and whistles that go with it. It's why they book tables at restaurants where you have to wait 3 weeks to get a booking, and you're then charged a small fortune to have a set menu. You go not for the dining experience, but to be seen or to tell others that you've eaten that. This, I noted in my earlier lecture, is how hierarchies are established in appetite-based worlds, in contrast to the procedures associated with honor-based worlds. So if appetite and spirit, or thumos, begin to merge this way, it becomes increasingly difficult to make distinctions among them in the literature, which then can be applied to the study of foreign policy. Indeed, when we read foreign policy literatures, what we increasingly find is that what clearly are concerns or claims for status are described and sold to peoples on the basis of security or well-being. This is an important issue. But if you look at the nuclear race, the race to get to the moon, various other things, these were clearly issues of status, but they were sold by other means. So one has to devise other techniques for teasing out the relative importance of motives. And what I do, for example, with World War I or with the Iraq War, is to show the problems that exist when trying to explain the initiation of these wars in terms of either appetite or security, but instead to offer evidence in support of the drive for standing and status, and recognition on the part of policymakers in several of these conflicts that what they were doing was possibly inimical to their security. This is most evident in 1914. I hope you will read the cases and find them convincing, or at least credible. Now, where does this leave us? With respect to international relations, I makes a very strong argument for including thumos along with appetite and security, fear, as a primary motive of international relations, and acknowledging, as I laid out in the first lecture, that each of these motives has a different calculus of cooperation and conflict, that each generates a different kind of hierarchy, and that two of the three, appetite, reason, and thumos, all rest on principles of justice, or the latter on combinations of principles of justice. I secondly argued that any of these models, mine or realism and liberalism and Marxism, describe ideal worlds, not real worlds. Real worlds combine elements of all these motives, and they combine them in the ways of a mixture, not of solutions. You may remember in high school chemistry that solutions are things when you mix together, they become joined in a way that you can't separate or distinguish between them anymore. For example, the way sugar dissolves in water. A mixture retains the components, retain their original character. So mixing oil with water will do that. It will separate out. This is true of our motives. So foreign policy gives evidence of often these multiple human drives which find expression in thumos, appetite, and fear is really a response, not a motive in and of itself. And that theorists err in trying to use only one of these to explain foreign policy behavior, rather than ignoring or explaining away behavior that may seem as discrepant. You have to bring in multiple motives to the picture to offer a more comprehensive and convincing account of the foreign policy at hand. I also, in the conclusions, look at the rise of the state. The generally accepted view, which developed in the late 20th century, was to quote Charles Tilly, that the state made war and war made the state. The war-making of states required armies, bureaucracies to supply them with what they needed, to raise money for the war. All of this required state building. The more states waged war, the more they required a state, and the more they required support from citizens, and this too leads to particular kinds of states. I don't dispute that this process went on, but I argue that much of war was fought for standing, particularly in the era of state building. You look at Louis XIV or his contemporaries, they're primarily interested in gaining standing and honor and prestige. They see the state as extensions of themselves, l'état c'est moi, according to Louis XIV. So this is what is driving war, but of equal importance, they're claiming status by other means, through the building of palaces, of urban development of their cities with parks, by engaging in science and exploration, by supporting the arts, particularly the plastic arts, opera, painting. All of this requires money and bureaucracies. It's as much involved with state building as is war, and if we look at the 17th and 18th centuries, we find that in fact more money is spent on display of this kind than on war. So here too, there's a hidden dimension of what's going on, and it is attributable to thumos. Finally, we come to prospect theory, which, as most of you probably know, argues that people are more willing to take risks to avert losses than they are to make gains, but that loss and gain are subjectively defined. I don't dispute this, but here too I argue that psychologists like good cardinal scales, therefore they like people making decisions in terms of lives